I am going to talk to you about a bike I own, but I own in Portugal. That's a 1995 Honda Africa Twin. And if I could swap bikes, I would much rather have the DL650 in Europe than the Africa Twin. The Africa Twin is just a very cool bike, and I got that red, white, and blue paint scheme. And of course, the Africa Twin, it's a 750 V-twin. And in Europe, you can get a Africa Twin relatively cheap. They are still pretty expensive because people really like Honda brand in Europe. But for about 3,000 to 4,000 euros, you could get a Honda Africa Twin. One of the things that surprised me about the Africa Twin is that it drinks gas. It's not as efficient as the vstrom. And for me, when you're in Europe, you want an efficient bike. And that's why one of the things I'm trying to do is in Europe, it's very important to have an efficient vehicle because Europe, the gas there is extremely expensive, and it's like 20 euros to fill up your motorcycle. So that's like $26 just to fill up a motorcycle. It's insane. And I think if I was in Europe and I was there more often, I would want something efficient. I think a CB500 for Europe, that's the one you want to get. It gets like 70 miles to the gallon if you're babying it. And I think they're very popular there because that is a very European looking style of bike. The V-twin of the Africa Twin is just so thirsty. And it's a very heavy bike. Man, I was so surprised. That thing, it's the only bike that I dropped, and I dropped it off-road. And it was just so unbelievably heavy to pick it up because it's so top-heavy. In the 90s, bikes were made a little bit more robust. So that bike became a tank, and it does wear you out. Another thing that's horrible with the Africa Twin from the 90s is that the fuel pump goes bad on it. So I've had to replace the fuel pump on my Africa Twin while I was on a tour, and that's a very expensive proposition. I think it was like 300 euro, about $400, like very expensive. Now, the guys that do have the Africa Twins there, they realize that the fuel pump is kind of like an Achilles heel for the Africa Twin. So they replace it with a, it's called a facet pump, and it's a very inexpensive RC airplane fuel pump that carries the same voltage. And instead of paying 400 euros, you pay $30 for it, and that's it. I brought two to Europe now, but of course my fuel pump is still good. It's just one of those things, like you would think that maybe Honda would design a better fuel pump. I don't understand it, but I do appreciate that the fuel pump is outside of the bike instead of the inside. But the Africa Twin, I think for me, I love the style of the Africa Twin. I don't particularly like the V-twin, even though a lot of people like bikes for the V-twin. I prefer a bike that's very fuel efficient, and normally that's a twin cylinder, inline twin cylinder. And riding that bike around, it's extremely heavy, but it handles fine. I mean, it's got a lot of torque for a 750. But by comparison to this bike, the V-twin of the V-strom is a little bit smoother than the V-twin of the Africa Twin. Now, the Africa Twin from the 90s, it's got the airbox right here. So you can remove a couple screws, pull it out, and change the air filter. For this bike, it's a pain because you have to remove the fuel tank. And I hate having to remove the fuel tank for anything. That's why I like the NC750X. That would be a good bike for Europe as well. I think with the high gas prices in Europe, you really should consider a more efficient bike. And in Europe, of course, one of the things that happens is that a lot of people have these big bikes, like 1000s and stuff, but they, excuse me, they don't ride them every day. They have Vespas and scooters that they ride every day for commuting because the gas is just so unbelievably expensive. And I do like riding the Africa Twin. I'm thinking about importing it here since it's getting to the 25-year-old mark, but it's very difficult importing a Africa Twin from the 90s to the United States because they weren't EPA certified. So if you bring a bike that's not 25 years old to the United States, you're basically screwed out of luck because they're not going to send the bike back on their own. You would have to pay to send the bike back, like import the bike to Portugal or to Europe. And a lot of the bikes that don't meet EPA regulations at the dock, customs or whatever, they get destroyed. Yeah, you heard this right. They do get destroyed. But you're starting to see a trickle of really interesting cars and bikes from Europe because they're reaching the 25-year-old mark and people are getting savvy and bringing them in. And of course they're collector's items and whatever. I think I'm just going to bring that bike in here, and maybe, I'm not really sure about how much it would cost. I've read that it got very expensive and it almost defeats the purpose. Like you can fly it in, it's about $2,000. I mean, it's very cost prohibitive. So I'm not really sure what I would do. If you guys have any ideas on how to import a motorcycle from Europe to the United States, just post up below. I would really appreciate it. I've looked into it. It's, unless you know somebody, you have to go with one of the big importers and they rape you. I mean, it's very expensive. So I wouldn't be opposed to riding it somewhere to get imported as well. A lot of rich guys from the United States import their bikes to Europe as well. I think one of the reasons I don't want the Africa Twin in Europe anymore is because I have to keep paying the registration, and the registration for a 750cc bike is really expensive. So I would rather just get a smaller scooter to kind of get around there, because now that I ride 50s here in the United States, you should be able to ride everywhere, scooters in Europe, and I should be able to like link things together. So I was thinking maybe getting a 110cc Honda or something from Yamaha. It's a lot better to ride one of those instead of the Africa Twin, so I think I'm going to do that. So if you guys have any idea about importing the Africa Twin, just post up below.